This morning, for a few moments, I spoke about the fact that my dad was a fisherman. And I talked a little bit about the fact that when I was certainly in my early teenage years, I spent a lot of time out fishing with my dad and Mr. Lyle. And I guess because of that, I've always felt that I could sort of relate to Peter the fisherman, in a way maybe different than most other biblical characters. But Peter was much more than a fisherman. Of course, Peter became a disciple of Jesus, and Peter became a great leader and an influential leader in the establishment of the early church. And so this evening I want us to continue to look at the encounters that Peter had with Jesus and what we can learn from them. And in particular this evening, I want us to look at three encounters. The first I've called Just One Touch. The second, A Step of Faith. And finally, Who's Really in Charge? And so first of all, just one touch. Now we know that Jesus called Peter to follow him. And he said to Peter, you know, I want you to be fishers of men. And it seemed like immediately, Peter didn't really have to think about it a lot. And immediately he seemed like he jumped out of the boat and he just followed Jesus. So on the outside it might appear that Peter maybe made a rash decision because he quit his job so quickly to follow Jesus. And history shows us that Peter at that time was married and he had children and a family. So, you know, we wonder what part, if any, did his wife play in that decision? You know, was she shocked to discover that Peter had quit his job and that he was going to follow this man named Jesus, who she may or may not have known a lot about? So we wonder, did she agree with his move? You know, how concerned was she about what would happen to the family? Who was going to support the family financially? And obviously it would mean that Peter would be away a lot, and how would that affect her? And we're not really given exact answers to any of these questions as to you know, what she thought about his decision. But later we will discover that she did support Peter, and that she did support him in a very real way. That support, the support that he would get from his wife many years later, was probably influenced by this next encounter with Jesus we will look at. So after Peter had made his decision to follow Jesus, Matthew continues in his gospel story with the famous Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and 7. And then chapter 8 says, when Jesus came down from the mountainside. What happened when Jesus came down from the mountainside? Well, we see very quickly three specific miracles of healing performed by Jesus. Three of them were witnessed by Peter. First, I read it earlier, there was the man with leprosy. Second, it was the servant of the centurion. But it is the third miracle of healing that I want us to look at. Those first two healings were most likely to people that Peter did not know. He had no personal connection with them. But this third one involves a close family member. It involved Peter's mother-in-law. And so we read in Matthew 8:14 to 15. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. Now, while Peter had witnessed the previous two miracle healings, this one would be much different. This one was much different because it had a personal touch. It had a personal touch. You see, we can see or we can hear about miracles happening in people's lives, but it takes on a whole new perspective when it happens in our lives or in the people that are close to us. Now, if you look at that quickly and you read the words in bed with a fever, you know, we today might not say, well that, you know, didn't seem to be too extreme. But remember, 2,000 years ago, there were no antibiotics like there are today. And this little lady couldn't go to the doctor and get a prescription and then take it to her pharmacy and get it filled. And while she was there, probably pick up a bottle of Tylenol to help alleviate the pain. There was none of that. And so 2,000 years ago, a persistent fever could and often did lead to other complications and eventually death. And there's no reason to think that Peter probably wasn't very concerned about his mother-in-law. And after witnessing Jesus' previous 2 miracle healings, he may have immediately thought about his mother-in-law. Was that the reason that Jesus went to Peter's house? Well, we don't know that. But we know that when Jesus did go there, that he touched the hand of this lady. Peter knew the power of Jesus' touch. The minute Jesus reached out his hand to touch his mother-in-law, I believe Peter knew what was going to happen, because he had witnessed what happened before when Jesus touched somebody. He had seen it firsthand. And so I don't believe it was any surprise to Peter that upon Jesus' touch, his mother-in-law was immediately healed. Scripture says the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. Now, I recently saw an advertisement for Tylenol, and it said that one of its products starts to work in 30 seconds. And that, as well as other medication that is on the market today, well, we know that some of it is at least, it tells us that it can work pretty quick. But you know, none of that can compare with the relief that Jesus provided with his touch. It was instantaneous. And Jesus didn't just provide an 8-hour relief on her. This wasn't just a momentary relief. Jesus cured her completely. So, what would be the significance going forward of this event for Peter? Beyond the physical healing itself, and I believe that obviously Peter and his wife would have been quite overjoyed that this lady was now well, but beyond the physical healing itself, Peter learned that day a very important characteristic of Jesus. Peter learned that Jesus cared about people. He began to realize that this man wasn't just someone on a political mission, that maybe that's what they were thinking initially, that he was going to be a political leader. I believe Peter saw much more than healing in the touch of Jesus, for he saw love. Peter's wife was also a witness. And here was a lady who was dealing with her mother's sickness, as well as her husband's decision now to leave his job and follow Jesus. And we don't know what she was going through. But we wonder, what impact did this event have on her? Well, that question is partially answered by the Apostle Paul. Actually, we find it in 1 Corinthians 9 and 5. When the Apostle Paul says, don't we have the right to bring a believing wife with us, as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do, and as Peter does? So from that verse, we know that Peter's wife joined him at some point in time on his missionary journey, that she too was a believer. And we wonder how much of an impact that this particular event had on her life. Now, it's been 2,000 years since that event, and Jesus has touched the lives of a countless number of people since. And he's still touching the lives of people. It's physical healing, it's emotional healing, it's spiritual healing. His touch is far-reaching and powerful. So this evening I ask you, have you had an encounter with Jesus and experienced his touch in your life? Can you relate to the songwriter who penned the words, "He touched me, and oh the joy that floods my soul"? Whatever your situation may be this evening, whatever your need, nothing can have as great an impact as an encounter with Jesus and just one touch of the Master's hand. And secondly, I want us to look at a step of faith. A step of faith. A year or more now passed since this event where Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. And during that time, a lot had happened. And there were many more miracles and many more changed lives as Jesus traveled from place to place. He taught the ways of God, and he proclaimed his gospel message to the people. And Peter was a witness to all of this. By now, Peter's life had obviously made a 360-degree turn. From casting nets into the sea in the hope of catching fish, to casting the Word of God to a lost people in the hope of saving souls. But Peter had just witnessed another of Jesus' miracles. This time it was the feeding of 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And we then read in Matthew 14:22-27, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up to a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. There was a vicious storm. The disciples were out in the boat. And these men of God, yes, these disciples of Jesus, they were scared. They were fearful. Okay, they were downright terrified. What they needed more than anything else in these moments was an encounter with Jesus. And so we read, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they cried. And they cried out in fear. Now, I've never saw what I thought was a ghost. And I'm not sure how I would react if I did. But somehow I think I understand their reaction. I think I understand their fear. And not only did I understand it, I believe that Jesus understood it. Because we read Jesus' words. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And there had probably never been a time in their lives where they were so glad to hear the voice of Jesus. Well, what did they do? Well, 11 of the disciples breathed a sigh of relief, wiped the sweat from their brows, and took a seat in the boat. But not the bold, impulsive Peter. Not Peter. For Peter had an idea. In verse 28-29 we read, Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. This was an encounter with Jesus like Peter had never had before. Now, was this just an impulsive move? Was this Peter's character? Was it an impulsive and bold move and he gave it without really having sufficient thought? Or was Peter literally stepping out in faith? Stepping out in faith sufficient for him to miraculously defy the forces of nature and to literally walk on water? Well, maybe it was some of both. But I believe that it was faith that gave him the courage to lift his feet over the boat. It was faith that planted his feet solid upon the water. And it was definitely faith that enabled him to take those initial steps without sinking. Now that's where Peter's faith took him. So my question this evening to you is, where is your faith taking you? Have you had an encounter with Jesus that has taken your faith to the extreme? Now we might call the faith it took for Peter to step out of the boat and walk on water. We call that, I think, pretty extreme. But you know something? The greatest step of faith that we can ever take is when we believe in our hearts that Jesus died for us and we accept him as our personal Savior. That is the most extreme faith that we can ever have. No other step of faith, walking on water, doesn't compare to it. No greater step of faith than when we step out and we accept Jesus as our Savior. No other step of faith will have as great an impact on your life. And so this evening I ask you, have you taken that step? And if not, you need to. What happens after we take that step of faith? Well, yes, our lives in many ways can become a roller coaster of adventure, whereby we are given opportunities by God to exercise our faith. And every step of faith we take will help us grow in our relationship with God. But, yeah, there's a but. There will be times when our faith will not be perfect. And Peter was to find that out. But, that three-letter word that transformed this moment in history from Peter, from tremendous victory to what was apparent defeat. For in Matthew 14 and 30 we read, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" So what happened to Peter? Well, the bottom line is that Peter did what countless others have done. Yes, he made an initial step of faith, a wonderful initial step of faith. But then he allowed his human fears to convince him that his faith was not enough. That his faith was not enough. So, none of us have tested our faith by attempting to walk on water. At least nobody have admitted it to me. But let me confess something to you this evening. The story of Peter, I learned that when I was a very young child in Sunday school. And I remember, and I can remember maybe a couple circumstances. I can picture them vivid in my mind, sitting in the boat with Dad, maybe no more than 9 or 10 years old, probably. And I would think about Peter's story. And I would wonder to myself, do I have the faith to make a similar attempt? And I would think to myself, what would happen if I stepped out over the side of the boat? Would I be able to, like Peter, walk on water? Would I have that faith? Well, you know, I never did find out that answer. Yeah, some of it was probably because I didn't have enough faith. But more of it was because I knew that if I made the even very attempt to get out over the side of the boat, that I would never get in Dad's boat again. And maybe that's what stopped me more than even my faith. But you know, this evening, many of us have stepped out and we have took our faith to heights that we never thought possible. And we, like Peter, for maybe a brief moment or maybe even longer moments, we've marveled at what our faith can do. But there have also been times, maybe for some of us more times, like Peter, when we have faltered. And just when we thought that nothing could stop us now, our human fears and our human weaknesses have brought us down. But like with many of our failures in life, there is always a silver lining. And Peter was to discover just that. For as Peter slipped beneath the ocean water, he could only think of one thing to do. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Peter may not have had sufficient faith to continue walking on the water, but he still had enough faith to believe that Jesus could still save him. And Jesus did just that. He rescued Peter from the stormy water, and he returned him to the boat with the other disciples. Now, one of the most famous poems of the 19th century was written by a British poet named Alfred Lord Tennyson. And the poem is entitled "In Memoriam." Now, I don't know if that name even rings a bell to you, but you may be familiar with one of the lines in the poem. Because it says, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." And the premise of these words, they've been applied to many different situations. And people often refer to those lines as better to have loved and lost than never loved at all to various different situations. In other words, it is better to have done certain things and failed than to have never done them at all. So I wonder, once Peter was safely back in the boat and he was sitting with the rest of the disciples, I wonder, would Peter have said, "It is better to have walked on water and sank than to never have walked on water at all"? The fact is, Peter did something, though maybe only for a brief moment in time, that no human had done before. The Israelites had walked through the Red Sea, but Peter literally walked on the sea. He had shown what one could do when exercising faith in an all-powerful God. Jesus would later tell his disciples in Matthew 21 and 21, "If you have faith and do not doubt, you can say to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself in the sea,' and it will be done." Peter could affirm such a statement because his faith had already defied the laws of nature. Peter discovered that in those moments when his faith was weak, God remained faithful to him. And in our moments of little faith, in our moments of doubt, when we cry out, "Lord, save me," God will always be faithful to us. He reaches down like he did with Peter, and he lifts us up as whatever our predicament might be, and he places us on solid ground. And every encounter we have with Jesus prepares us for our next step of faith. So I ask you, do you believe it is better to have exercised your faith and failed than to have never exercised your faith at all? Now finally this evening, we have who's really in charge? Who's really in charge? Some time had passed again now between this encounter and Peter's next encounter. In Matthew 16, 13 to 20, which we read earlier, Jesus asked his disciples, "What are people saying about me? Who do people say that I am?" And then he made it a more personal question. And he said, "But who do you say I am?" as he looked at the disciples. And it was probably no surprise that Peter was the first one to speak up. And Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." And then Jesus says to Peter, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now Peter had to be on an incredibly spiritual high after this event. And then we read in Matthew's Gospel, "From this time on." So if you're reading this for the first time and you don't know what happens, then I think that many of us would probably say, from this time on, Peter grew even more in faith and wisdom, and he always displayed his faith and wisdom in everything he did. Well, half of that is true. I believe Peter did grow in faith and wisdom. But it wasn't always displayed in everything he did. You see, Peter was still on a learning experience. And some of that learning was done not on the mountaintop, but in the valley. And such was Peter's next encounter with Jesus. In Matthew 16 and 21, we read, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hand of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." Now it's very important that we notice that Jesus uses the word must. Must. Jesus said he must go to Jerusalem. He must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. He didn't say that I'm going to go or I will be. It wasn't an option to Jesus. In using the words must, Jesus was saying, I have to do this. I need to do this. I'm compelled to do this. His must go and his must be killed were not based on the desires of anybody else, even though that's the way it maybe appeared to others, but they were only based on the desires of Jesus and his Heavenly Father. For we read in John 10 and 18, "No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily. For I have the authority to lay it down when I want to, and also to take it up again. For this is what my Father has commanded." The disciples, Peter included, even though they had spent so much time with Jesus, they still didn't have a clear understanding of Jesus' mission on earth. They certainly didn't see it as Jesus did. And Peter, who was probably still on this spiritual high from Jesus' words to him earlier, Peter decided, well, I'm going to sort of set the record straight here now with Jesus. He doesn't understand some things. And so we read in Matthew 16 and 22, Peter took Jesus aside. And he began to rebuke him. And he said, "Never, Lord. This shall never happen to you." And so we sort of think and say, just imagine Peter rebuking Jesus. And if you sort of can get your imagination around that Peter says to Jesus, "Just come with me for a second. I want to talk to you." And then he rebukes Jesus. He says, "No, you're not going to be killed. None of this is going to happen to you." And Peter is reprimanding Jesus. He's sort of admonishing him and he's scolding him. We might think, well, who do Peter think he is? Now, I like to think, and I believe that Peter did this with good intention, and his actions were solely based on protecting his Lord and Master. But he was about to learn a very critical lesson. Now, Peter waited for Jesus' reaction. And I think Peter was expecting Jesus to react by words of gratitude and appreciation and thanking Peter for his support. But instead we read in chapter 16 and verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Wow, Peter must have been humiliated. He must have been shocked. He must have been devastated. Not long ago, Peter was receiving a wonderful commendation from Jesus. And he probably was envisioning himself as, well, maybe I'm the top disciple. And I believe I'm sort of Jesus' right-hand man. But now with this reprimand from Jesus, it was like going from an A+ in school to an F. It was like a wonderful promotion to a demotion. It was from the highest compliment that one could get to the lowest insult. What happened? Why did Jesus rebuke Peter in such a harsh way? He looked at Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, Jesus wasn't comparing Peter to Satan, but it was a reference to Peter's words that Jesus would not have to be killed. You see, that was Satan's desire. Satan would want nothing more than Jesus would forsake his Father's command to die for the sin of mankind, to forsake the work of man's redemption and salvation. Peter's words, no matter how sincere on his part, they indicated Satan's line of thinking. And they would be nothing but a stumbling block to Jesus on the road to the cross. Peter's thoughts and his words were based solely on human will and not the will of God. And Jesus knew it would be crucial for Peter going forward that he put him in his place, that he set the record straight, and yes, that he would teach him who's really in charge. You see, part of our human problem is that we like to think we know best. And we sometimes make assumptions about how we should best live our lives and how we should best advance the gospel of Christ. And like Peter, we sometimes, with all good intention, we plot the course that we feel is best. And then on other occasions, we, maybe like Peter as well, want to do it the way that it makes the most sense to us. The most human sense, that is. And so whether knowingly or subconsciously, we sometimes can act like we are the ones in charge when it comes to promoting the kingdom of God. Well, let me tell you that we're not. We're not the ones in charge. For God is always in charge. And we do our part when we seek His will and are obedient to that will. Peter could not see. There was no way that Peter could see that how Jesus being killed, how Jesus dying on the cross could advance the kingdom of God. It made no sense to him. But Peter could not see the bigger picture. And so, because we too are not always privy to that bigger picture, we always have to seek the will of God for our daily lives. For if we solely act on our human will, then yes, we risk inadvertently promoting the work of Satan, and we become a stumbling block to Jesus. Instead, we follow the words of the chorus. I want God's way to be my way, as I journey here below. For there is no other highway that a child of God should go. Though the road seems dark and rough, if he leads me, 'tis enough. For I want God's way to be my way every day. And if we truly want God's way to be our way, then we have to live our life fully accepting who's really in charge. And that's God.